Being nice was never the problem. The problem is what people do with your kindness once they realize it comes without conditions. The painful truth about human nature is that kindness without boundaries is not seen as generosity. It is seen as availability. And availability, left unchecked, slowly becomes something people feel entitled to. This is why so many kind, thoughtful, generous people find themselves disrespected, overlooked, and quietly used by the very people they tried hardest to please. It has nothing to do with how good their heart is. It has everything to do with how human psychology responds to unconditional access. Once you understand this one law, you will never confuse being nice with being powerful again. Why niceness without boundaries gets mistaken for weakness. Most people believe that kindness earns respect automatically. They assume that if they are agreeable, accommodating, and endlessly patient, others will naturally appreciate them more over time. But human nature rarely works this way. People do not measure your value by how much you give. They measure it by what it costs you to give it. When your kindness comes without limits, without hesitation, without any cost to the other person, it stops registering as generosity. It starts registering as normal. And once something becomes normal, it stops being appreciated. Think about someone who says yes to every request. They cover shifts no one else wants. They lend money without asking when it will be returned. They listen to complaints for hours without ever mentioning their own problems. At first, people may call them thoughtful, dependable, easygoing, but slowly, something shifts. The requests increase. The gratitude decreases. Eventually, people stop asking if this person is available and start assuming they are. That assumption is the moment kindness quietly transforms into obligation. Robert Greene often explains that power is not built through generosity alone. It is built through the perception of scarcity and consequence. A kind act that has no boundary attached to it teaches people that your kindness is unlimited, and unlimited resources are rarely respected. Human beings, whether they intend to or not, instinctively test the limits of what they can take. Not because they are cruel, but because human nature is opportunistic by design. If no line is drawn, people assume there is no line to cross. This is the uncomfortable truth that most kind people never want to accept. Being agreeable is not the same as being respected. You can be endlessly polite and still be quietly taken for granted. You can smile through every inconvenience and still watch people place you last on their list of priorities. Kindness on its own does not command anything. It simply exists. What commands respect is kindness paired with the demonstrated ability to say no, to walk away, and to protect your own time and energy when it is disregarded. Now compare that to someone who is kind but selective. They help when they choose to, not because they feel obligated to. They say yes when it aligns with their values, and they say no without guilt when it does not. Their kindness feels different to the people receiving it. It feels intentional. It feels like a gift rather than a service. This is because the other person understands that this kindness could be withheld. And anything that could be withheld but is given anyway carries weight. This is the paradox almost no one is taught. The kindness that protects itself is respected. The kindness that sacrifices itself is eventually ignored. Two people can perform the exact same act of generosity, yet be treated in completely different ways because one gave from a place of self-respect and the other gave from a place of fear. Fear of disappointing someone, fear of conflict, fear of being disliked. That fear is invisible to the eye, but it is never invisible to the nervous system of the person receiving it. People sense desperation for approval the same way they sense confidence. It shows in your hesitation, your over-explaining, your inability to simply say, "I can't." And once people sense that your kindness comes from fear rather than choice, they stop treating your generosity as something valuable. They begin treating it as something owed. That is where resentment quietly begins to grow, not in the other person, but in you. Because deep down, you know you gave more than you wanted to. You know you said yes when you meant no. And that quiet erosion of your own boundaries is the real cost of being nice without being strong. Once you understand that kindness without limits invites disrespect, the next step is learning why explaining yourself constantly makes the problem even worse. Why over-explaining kills the respect kindness should earn there is a specific habit that nice people fall into more than almost anyone else. They explain themselves constantly. Every no comes with 3 paragraphs of justification. Every boundary is immediately softened with an apology. Every request they decline is followed by a list of reasons designed to make the other person feel okay about being told no. On the surface, this looks considerate. In reality, it quietly destroys the very respect that kindness is supposed to earn. Here is why. When you over-explain a boundary, you are not just communicating information. You are communicating anxiety. You are telling the other person that their approval of your decision matters more than the decision itself. And the moment someone senses that your comfort depends on their reaction, they gain leverage over you without ever asking for it. Robert Greene often points out that power flows toward whoever needs the least from the interaction. The person who requires no explanation, no permission, and no reassurance holds the position of strength. The person constantly justifying themselves has already surrendered it. Imagine 2 people declining the same invitation. The first says, "I'm so sorry. I really wanted to come, but I have so much going on right now and I feel terrible. I promise I'll make it up to you. Please don't be upset." The second says, "I can't make it this time, but I hope it goes well." Both said no. Only one of them said it with dignity intact. The first response reveals fear of disappointing. The second reveals calm certainty. And human beings, whether consciously or not, respect certainty far more than they respect apology. This does not mean kindness should disappear or that consideration for others is unnecessary. It means the constant need to justify your limits is not kindness at all. It is often a symptom of fearing rejection more than you value your own peace. Genuine kindness does not require a defense. It simply exists as an offer, freely given or freely withheld without needing to be earned through excessive explanation. There is a psychological cost to this pattern that most people never notice. Every time you over-explain a decision, you train the people around you to expect a negotiation instead of a boundary. They learn that your first no is rarely final. They learn that enough pushback, enough guilt, or enough persistence will eventually wear you down. This is not because they are manipulative by nature. It is because you have shown them through repeated behavior that persistence works on you. And once persistence works once, it becomes the default strategy people use whenever they want something from you. The strongest people understand a different approach entirely. They give a boundary once, calmly and without hostility, and they do not repeat themselves. They do not escalate their tone. They do not soften the boundary out of guilt. They simply hold it the same way they would hold any other fact about themselves. This calm consistency does something powerful. It removes the incentive to test you because people quickly learn there is nothing to gain by pushing further. Kindness paired with clarity is one of the rarest qualities a person can develop, precisely because most people believe kindness and clarity cannot coexist. They think being direct means being unkind, and being kind means being endlessly flexible. But the truth is the opposite. The kindest thing you can do for a relationship is to be honest about your limits early, rather than resentfully enforcing them after years of silent sacrifice. Clarity prevents the very resentment that destroys relationships from the inside. Once you stop over-explaining your boundaries and start stating them with quiet confidence, something remarkable happens. People stop testing you as often because they sense there is nothing left to negotiate. And once your boundaries no longer require defense, the next challenge is learning to recognize the difference between generosity and self-abandonment before it costs you your identity. The difference between generosity and self-abandonment there is a line between being generous and disappearing into other people's needs, and most kind people cross it without ever realizing it happened. Generosity gives from abundance. Self-abandonment gives from emptiness, hoping that enough sacrifice will eventually be noticed, appreciated, or repaid. The tragedy is that these two behaviors can look identical from the outside. Both involve saying yes. Both involve showing up for others. But internally, they come from entirely different places. And that difference determines whether your kindness builds respect or quietly destroys your sense of self. Self-abandonment often begins with good intentions. You want to be supportive. You want to be the reliable one, the understanding one, the person others can always count on. But somewhere along the way, being needed becomes confused with being valued. You start saying yes to avoid disappointing people rather than because you genuinely want to help. You start prioritizing everyone else's comfort over your own peace. And slowly, your identity becomes defined by what you do for others rather than who you actually are. Robert Greene frequently warns that those who give too much of themselves away often become invisible in the process, not because they lack value, but because they stop asserting it. When your presence is defined entirely by usefulness, people begin to relate to you as a function rather than a person. They think of you as the one who helps, the one who listens, the one who fixes things. They rarely think of you as someone with needs of your own because you have never given them a reason to consider it. This is one of the most painful realizations kind people eventually face. They spend years being the emotional support system for friends, family, or partners, only to discover that when they finally need support themselves, it is nowhere to be found. Not because those people are cruel, but because the relationship was never built on mutual exchange. It was built on one person giving endlessly and the other person receiving without ever learning to reciprocate. Human nature adapts to whatever pattern is repeated most consistently. And if the pattern has always been one-sided giving, that is exactly what continues. The uncomfortable truth is that self-abandonment often masquerades as virtue. It feels noble to put others first. It feels selfless to ignore your own exhaustion for the sake of someone else's comfort. But there is a difference between selflessness and self-erasure. Selflessness chooses to give from a place of strength. Self-erasure gives because it does not know how to exist without being useful to someone else. One is an act of love. The other is often an unconscious attempt to earn the right to take up space. Consider two people who both spend their weekend helping a friend move. The first does it because they enjoy being useful and genuinely wants to help. If asked, they would say no without guilt if they were exhausted or had other commitments that mattered more. The second does it because they feel obligated, because they fear being seen as unhelpful, because saying no feels like risking the relationship entirely. Both show up, both carry boxes, but only one of them walks away with their sense of self intact. The other quietly resents the exhaustion while smiling through it, because true self-abandonment cannot admit its own cost, even to itself. This is why learning to distinguish generosity from self-abandonment is essential to reclaiming your power without losing your kindness. Ask yourself before saying yes, whether you are offering this from strength or from fear. Are you helping because it aligns with your values, or because the thought of disappointing someone feels unbearable? That single moment of honest reflection changes everything because it shifts you from operating on autopilot to operating with intention. The people who command real respect are not the ones who give the most. They are the ones whose giving is chosen rather than compulsive. Their yes means something because their no is equally available. And once you learn to give from that place of genuine choice, your kindness stops being something people quietly exploit and starts becoming something they deeply value. Once you understand the difference between generosity and self-abandonment, the next step is learning why silence and distance, not confrontation, are the most powerful tools for reclaiming the respect you have been giving away. Why distance teaches people what words never could. Most nice people believe that if someone disrespects them, the correct response is to explain how it made them feel. They believe communication alone will fix the imbalance. And in relationships built on mutual respect, this is often true. But in relationships where someone has already learned that your kindness has no limit, words rarely change anything. What changes behavior is consequence, and the most effective consequence a calm person can offer is quiet, unannounced distance. This is not about punishment or revenge. It is about recognizing that people learn through patterns, not through promises. If someone repeatedly takes advantage of your kindness and you respond only with conversation, you are teaching them that the relationship continues exactly as it was, regardless of how they treat you. But the moment your attention, your energy, and your availability begin to quietly decrease, something shifts inside them. They start to notice the absence of what they once assumed was guaranteed. Robert Greene often illustrates that withdrawal creates far more psychological impact than confrontation ever could. Confrontation gives the other person something to respond to, something to argue against, something to defend. Distance gives them nothing to fight, only an uncomfortable silence that forces them to sit with the reality of what they have lost. This is why the calmest people are often the most difficult to manipulate. They do not announce their boundaries with anger. They simply enforce them through action. Think about someone who constantly cancels plans at the last minute, knowing you will always accommodate the change. If you continue rearranging your schedule every time, you confirm that your time holds no real value. But if you begin quietly prioritizing your own plans instead, without lectures or ultimatums, the message becomes unmistakable. Your time is no longer guaranteed. And people rarely appreciate consistency until they experience its absence. This kind of distance is not cold. It is not petty. It is simply the natural result of redirecting your energy toward people and things that respect it. When kindness stops flowing toward those who take it for granted, it does not disappear. It moves elsewhere, toward relationships, goals, and versions of yourself that deserve it more. This shift is rarely dramatic. It looks like slower replies, fewer favors, less availability. But over time, its effect is undeniable, because people cannot help but notice when something they assumed was permanent quietly begins to fade. There is a psychological reason this works so effectively. Human beings rarely value what feels unconditional. The moment they sense conditions exist, even unspoken ones, they begin paying closer attention. Distance introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty forces reflection. The people who genuinely value your presence will notice the change and make an effort to close the gap. The people who only valued your usefulness will drift further away, revealing exactly where you stood all along. This is why silence and distance often accomplish what confrontation cannot. They do not require you to convince anyone of your worth. They simply allow your absence to communicate what your presence no longer will. And once someone experiences the discomfort of losing access to you, even briefly, the lesson embeds itself far deeper than any argument ever could. Once you understand that distance teaches lessons words cannot, the final step is realizing that true power comes not from becoming less kind, but from becoming so secure in your own worth that kindness no longer requires proving. Becoming kind and powerful at the same time, everything explored so far leads to one final truth. The goal was never to become less kind. Kindness, when it comes from strength rather than fear, is one of the most powerful qualities a person can possess. The goal is to stop confusing kindness with weakness and to stop believing that being agreeable is the same as being respected. Real power does not require you to abandon compassion. It requires you to attach compassion to self-respect so that your generosity is never mistaken for desperation. Most people spend years trying to prove their worth through how much they give, how easily they forgive, or how rarely they complain. But worth was never something that needed to be earned through endless accommodation. It existed the moment you did, independent of how many times someone chose to overlook it. The mistake was believing that being needed was the same thing as being valued, and that being agreeable would eventually be rewarded with appreciation. Robert Greene often reminds us that the most influential people throughout history were not defined by how much they gave away, but by how clearly they understood their own worth before offering anything to others. They were generous, but never at the expense of their own dignity. They were kind, but never in a way that erased their own boundaries. Their kindness carried weight precisely because it was never assumed. It was chosen deliberately, again and again, from a place of strength rather than obligation. This is the version of kindness worth becoming. Not the kind that says yes out of fear, but the kind that says yes because it genuinely wants to. Not the kind that explains itself endlessly, but the kind that offers boundaries calmly and moves forward without guilt. Not the kind that disappears into other people's needs, but the kind that remains fully present, fully generous, and fully itself, precisely because it never had to abandon its own identity to be loved. When you reach this point, something remarkable happens. People no longer take advantage of your kindness, not because you became harsh or guarded, but because your kindness no longer signals desperation for approval. It signals abundance. It signals someone who gives because they choose to, not because they are afraid of what happens if they don't. And ironically, this is when your kindness finally receives the appreciation it always deserved, because for the first time, it was never given away out of fear. So remember this. Whenever you feel tempted to shrink yourself to keep the peace or override your own needs to avoid disappointing someone else, your kindness was never the problem. The absence of a boundary around it was. Protect it the way you would protect anything valuable, and you will discover that being nice and being powerful were never opposites at all. They were always meant to exist together the moment you stopped confusing self-respect with selfishness.